Thank you. Good afternoon. When Leo told me that we would each have 12 minutes to speak, I was a bit taken aback because all I can do in 12 minutes is speak for 2 minutes and then annoy people for 10. But if you're determined to let me do that, Leo, I'm grateful for the opportunity, and now let me see if I can make you regret it. Education is filled to the brim with homilies and bromides, bumper sticker sentiments that we repeat without much thought because, who could disagree with an idea like children won't care what you know until they know that you care, or education isn't the filling of a pail but the lighting of a fire. Well, you can't light a fire in an empty pail. Another edu-homily that teachers express uncritically, which irritates me, is their goal to instill a lifelong love of books or reading. We've all said this, right? Well, why not a lifelong love of math, of science, of art, or of music, or history? As educators, our job is to ensure kids have the knowledge and skills they need to be happy, productive, and independent citizens. Why are we concerned at all with what they do or do not love? There is, however, one love that as teachers we arguably have an obligation to instill and promote. And that's a lifelong love of liberty, of freedom, of constitutional government, of civil society, of the rule of law. In other words, a lifelong love of America. Well, does that make you uncomfortable? Is that too overly patriotic for you, too even jingoistic? Well, consider, as teachers, most of us, nearly all of us, are public employees. We work for states, school districts, individual public schools. We draw a salary from our fellow citizens to work in the public's interest. So infusing children with a love of reading is laudable, but infusing them with a love of country is indispensable. That's controversial. How strange. Yuval Levin has observed that conservatism is gratitude. That's his quote. So in a talk several years ago, he remarked, and I'm going to quote him here, that conservatives tend to begin from gratitude for what is good and what works in our society and then strive to build on it, while liberals tend to begin from outrage at what is bad and broken and seek to uproot it. Well, look, thank goodness for those on the left who've been outraged at segregation, at child labor, and so on. That outrage keeps our nation growing. But heavens, how did it become some kind of secular sin to believe that our young people should revere the beliefs, practices, the institutions, and yes, here it comes, the virtues that made America the envy of the world? I do not intend to make a partisan argument. But candor, I think, requires that we face up to a problem that we have in civic education, and Levin's observation takes us to the heart of it. If it's a struggle to restore civics to the center of American education, if some of us suspect that civics is currently more about indoctrination than education, is that perhaps because there's so little gratitude at the heart of it? Our approach to civic education can give the impression that various forms of ingratitude, dissent, boycott, protest, are the highest expressions of citizenship. A few years ago, with the help of some of my colleagues at the Fordham Foundation, we examined every one of the mission statements for the 100 largest school districts in the U.S. It was an interesting exercise and frankly, a little bit sobering. The personal and private ends of education, preparation for college and career, for example, are very much more on the minds of the men and women the school district officials who write and adopt these statements and goals more than preparation for citizenship. So a few data points. The word college appears in 37 out of the 100 district mission statements. 46 mention career. Well over half, 59, of the 100 largest U.S. school districts make no mention whatsoever of civics or citizenship. The word global appears in the mission statements of 28 U.S. school districts, usually in phrases like global society, global economy, or global citizens. The word patriotic or patriotism appear in none of the 100 mission and vision statements, not one. Neither does the word America or American, not even once. So our theme today is finding common ground. It occurred to exactly none of the 100 largest school systems in this country to even mention the ground on which we stand in their mission or vision statements. As teachers, we are trained to avoid deficit thinking. Jessica alluded to it. We build on communities' assets and students' strengths. We do not dwell on disadvantages or shortcomings. But when we turn to civic education, we, many of us, embrace a deficit model. I mean, isn't that what we're doing with action civics and cultivating activism? Are we not guilty, at least somewhat, of fetishizing America's failures, never celebrating our accomplishments, when we view this nation as a collection of problems to be solved? Are we making sufficient room to remind our students about what is right about this country? Are we making sufficient room for gratitude? In her book, No Citizen Left Behind, Mira Levinson makes a very strong argument for action civics. She contrasts it with bland and uncontroversial service learning. And I'm going to quote her here. The very qualities that ensure widespread bipartisan support for service learning, she notes, also make it an inadequate tool for addressing the civic empowerment gap. This reinforces, she writes, a sense of powerlessness to make a difference via political action. Levinson also takes exception to the kind of tasks that low-income and immigrant youth of color do for free in service learning settings. Tasks like raking leaves, scrubbing graffiti, serving soup in food and soup kitchens. She writes, quote, "These are tasks they are ones that they or their parents would normally get paid to do in low-skill service jobs." These are important and substantial critiques, but they're not politically neutral. To her credit, Levinson is candid about that. Service learning, she writes, is inherently conservative, that's her words. It is, quote, merely participatory and ameliorative rather than activist and change-oriented. Let me be clear, it is not my intention to condemn action civics. I've taught it. It's not my intention to even criticize it. The question is whether we're creating in the minds of our students a vision of their country as exclusively antagonistic to their interests and well-being. We are saying that what we have been given, what we are preserving are wrong. We're saying that the past and the present are vice to be remedied by the virtuous reformers of today. So that's the opposite of gratitude. That's hubris. Let me be equally clear and equally emphatic that I'm not arguing for a civics and history curriculum that views America through rose-colored glasses. I've often said that a good course of study could be made from a close reading and discussion on day one of the preamble to the Constitution, its call to action to we the people, and careful reading of that enigmatic and lovely phrase, in order to build a more perfect union. And then every day after that might be given to an examination of the many ways in which we've met that goal, exceeded it, or fallen short. Writing in The American Interest in 2016, Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist and NYU professor, offered an eye-opening analysis of what he described as the clash between nationalists and globalists, which gave us the Brexit vote, the rise of Donald Trump, as well as the sense, his words, Haidt's words, that something dangerous and ugly is spreading. It's a very long and thoughtful essay. We don't have time to discuss it at length. I highly recommend it to you. And it was not written with education or civic education in mind, but I think it gets to the heart of our work. I do want to read you one quote from Haidt's essay. And as you listen to this, remember that patriotism appears in none of the school district mission statements that I referenced earlier. Haidt writes, "Nationalists see patriotism as a virtue. They think their country and culture are unique and worth preserving. This is a real and moral commitment, not opposed to cover up racist bigotry. Nationalists feel a bond with their country, and they believe that this bond imposes moral obligations both ways. Citizens have a duty to love and serve their country. Governments are duty-bound to protect their own people. There is nothing necessarily racist or base about this arrangement or social contract. Having a shared sense of identity, norms, and history generally promotes trust." So Haidt's essay is aimed at those of us who are concerned about creeping authoritarianism and threats to our democracy. It draws deeply on the work of an Australian political scientist named Karen Stenner, who studies authoritarianism, racism, and intolerance. Her core finding, per John Haidt, is that, again, another quote here from Stenner, authoritarianism is not a stable personality trait, it's a psychological predisposition to become intolerant when a person perceives a certain kind of threat. So in other words, we're basically tolerant, but we have a button on our foreheads, that's the way Haidt describes it, that when pushed focuses us on defending our in-group. That authoritarian button is activated by threats to the integrity of the moral order that we perceive, that perception that we're coming apart. So the challenge for our diverse, pluralistic, and democratic society, a challenge that, of course, as ever, falls most heavily on schools, the civic institution with the broadest reach in American life, is to blunt that sense that we're coming apart. But you see the paradox, right? Common sense and good intentions would suggest that exposure to difference, discussion and celebration of diversity, well, that should be critical to understanding and empathy. But if Haidt and Stenner are correct, that humane and intuitive impulse might be precisely the wrong one. If we're determined to take a stand against intolerance, the most effective response is to make a virtue of our sameness. So here's what Karen Stenner observes, again quoting, "Ultimately, nothing inspires greater tolerance from the intolerant than an abundance of common and unifying beliefs, practices, rituals, institutions, and processes." So this is precisely why e pluribus unum may be the greatest phrase in American history, powerful as any line in the Declaration or the Constitution. It recognizes that America's diversity, the pluralism in our histories and cultures and beliefs, but it also recognizes and elevates our oneness, our unum. Thank you. It says that we can respect our differences while being part of something together. So I hope all of this invites a thought exercise. As civic educators, are we wrong for all the right reasons? We seek to valorize diversity, reinvigorate our democracy to close the civic participation gap. Are we making it worse? Are we more likely to succeed if we cultivate an appreciation for the things that unite us, a spirit of gratitude, a clear-eyed gratitude, but a gratitude nonetheless for rights and responsibilities, constitutional protections, the rule of law, a lifelong love of America?
Thanks so much, Robert. Terrific. And on to Joe.
Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, thank you. First things first.